Sean Mallory sat alone on a wrought iron bench in Riverside Park, while snowflakes fell like silent accusations, each one melting against the charcoal wool of his custom-tailored overcoat before it could prove it had ever existed. His hands trembled as they gripped a paper coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, fingers that had signed documents moving millions now unable to hold something as simple as cheap cardboard steady. The lake before him had frozen into a sheet of gray glass that reflected nothing, appropriate for a man who'd spent 15 years building an empire while forgetting to build a life. Something about the complete stillness of this Tuesday afternoon made the carefully constructed walls he'd maintained since childhood crack in ways boardroom confrontations never could. His eyes burned with tears he refused to release, because crying was something he'd trained himself to stop doing the night his father walked out when Sean was 7 years old. The world seemed to have evacuated and left him as sole witness to winter's indifference, alone with thoughts he usually kept buried under layers of strategic planning and calculated decision-making. The memory of that night remained crystalline despite 25 years of trying to bury it, his father's silhouette disappearing through the apartment door, while 7-year-old Sean watched from his bedroom doorway. His mother had been working the night shift at the hospital, unaware her husband was leaving until she came home to find half the closet empty, and her son sitting motionless on the couch. No explanation had ever come, no phone call or letter, just absence where presence had been, a void that taught young Sean that people left without warning, and love was conditional on factors he couldn't control or predict. That lesson had calcified into operating principle, shaping every relationship choice he'd made since, ensuring he left first or never got close enough for leaving to matter. The foster system had reinforced those early lessons with systematic efficiency, each placement temporary by design, each connection severed before it could deepen into anything resembling permanence. He'd learned to pack his belongings in under 10 minutes, developed the ability to assess new environments for threats and opportunities within hours of arrival, mastered the art of being likable enough to avoid trouble, but not so endearing that goodbyes would hurt. By the time he aged out at 18, Sean had lived in 11 different homes and learned to trust exactly one person, the reflection he saw in mirrors who'd survived everything life threw at him. That survivor mentality had served him well in building his empire, but had left him fundamentally unable to believe in the kind of belonging other people seemed to take for granted. The tears on his face felt like betrayal of everything he'd built, weakness he couldn't afford in a world that punished vulnerability with ruthless efficiency. He'd cried exactly 3 times since childhood, each instance occurring alone in locked rooms where no one could witness the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. The first had been the night Catherine left, admitting she'd never loved him, but rather the lifestyle he provided, honesty that confirmed his deepest fears about his own unlovability. The second had been 2 years ago, when Marco's daughter was hospitalized with appendicitis, and Sean realized he envied his lieutenant's terror, because at least Marco had someone worth being terrified for. This third time felt different somehow, tears born not from specific loss, but from accumulated weight of years spent pretending isolation was choice rather than curse. His hands had gone numb from cold, the coffee cup's inadequate warmth long since dissipated into winter air that cared nothing for human discomfort. The park's usual population of joggers and dog walkers had thinned to nothing, sensible people choosing indoor warmth over the aesthetic appeal of snow-covered landscapes. Only Sean remained, stubbornly planted on iron that conducted cold through expensive fabric meant to project success rather than provide actual comfort. He wondered distantly if anyone would notice if he simply stayed here until hypothermia claimed him, then dismissed the thought as melodramatic self-pity unworthy of someone who'd survived much worse than loneliness. But survival and living were different things, he was realizing, and he'd been doing only the former for so long, he'd forgotten the latter was even possible. The coffee cup crumpled slightly under pressure from fingers that had forgotten their own strength, dark liquid seeping through the cheap cardboard to stain his leather gloves. Across the park, families clustered around a hot chocolate vendor, their laughter carrying across frozen air like radio signals from a frequency he'd never learned to tune into properly. He'd conquered the criminal underworld through intelligence rather than violence, building networks of loyalty through strategic thinking and keeping his hands clean in ways his predecessors never managed. Power had come easily, respect had followed inevitably, but the warmth he saw in those distant family units remained as foreign and unreachable as a language he'd never been taught. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could orchestrate complex operations across 3 states, but couldn't figure out how to stop the loneliness that gnawed at him during every quiet moment. Business provided structure and purpose, problems to solve and objectives to achieve, but it couldn't hold him at night, or care whether he woke up in the morning. His phone buzzed with 17 unread messages from associates who needed decisions, guidance, the calculated wisdom that had made him invaluable to people who would never actually know him. Sean looked at the notifications without really seeing them, his mind caught in the dangerous space between memory and present, where regret lived and multiplied. The bench beneath him conducted cold through expensive fabric, a physical discomfort he almost welcomed, because it was easier to process than the emotional numbness that had been his constant companion. He'd attended his Lieutenant Marco's daughter's birthday party 3 days ago, watched from the periphery as Marco lifted the girl onto his shoulders while she shrieked with delight. Something hollow and aching had opened in his chest that he couldn't name or dismiss, a sensation that lingered long after he'd left the celebration with its balloons and cake. That unnamed feeling had driven him to this park, to this bench, to this moment of sitting still long enough that his own thoughts could finally catch up and demand attention. The park's emptiness suited him perfectly because he'd never learned how to be around happiness without feeling like an anthropologist studying an alien species. Christmas decorations hung from lampposts in red and gold mockery, celebrating togetherness and joy with the same commercial enthusiasm they'd displayed since November 1st. Sean had purchased gifts for his key people's families, expensive items selected by his assistant and wrapped by professionals, gestures that maintained loyalty without requiring actual emotional investment. The ritual of gift-giving without connection felt increasingly hollow each year, mechanical performance of warmth he didn't actually possess, but knew how to simulate convincingly. He wondered, not for the first time, if anyone had ever actually seen him, or if they all just saw the position he occupied, the power he wielded. His empire ran on information and connection, invisible threads that bound people together through mutual benefit and carefully managed fear, yet he himself remained disconnected from anything resembling genuine human warmth. A couple walked past holding hands, their breath forming matching clouds in frozen air, and Sean looked away because witnessing intimacy felt like staring directly at the sun. His last relationship had ended 18 months ago, when Catherine finally admitted she was in love with his status, rather than his person, that she'd been performing affection the same way he'd been performing partnership. The honesty had been refreshing, even as it confirmed what he'd suspected all along, that he was fundamentally unknowable and therefore unlovable in any genuine sense. His childhood in the foster system had taught him self-sufficiency as survival mechanism, that depending on others led inevitably to disappointment and abandonment. Each new placement had been temporary, each connection provisional, until he'd learned to stop reaching for permanence and embrace transactional relationships that couldn't hurt him when they ended. The Mallory name he carried wasn't inherited, but chosen at 18, selected from a list of Irish surnames because it sounded respectable and memorable in equal measure. He'd built himself from nothing, crafted an identity through sheer force of will and strategic thinking, but somewhere in that construction process, he'd forgotten to include the parts that made a person, rather than just a role. His success was undeniable, his reputation formidable, his bank accounts obscene, yet sitting on this freezing bench watching his breath dissipate into nothing, he felt like the poorest man in the city. The tears that had been threatening finally broke free, sliding down his face in hot tracks that he didn't bother to wipe away, because no one was watching anyway. The sound of small footsteps crunching through snow registered before the words did, high-pitched and concerned in a way that immediately made him try to compose himself. A boy appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, small enough that the knitted cat ear beanie he wore made him look like a winter sprite from children's literature. Sean turned to his head slowly, trying to arrange his features into something that wouldn't frighten a child, but the tears were too fresh to hide completely. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, bundled in a puffy blue jacket that made his arms stick out at angles, mittens dangling from strings sewn into his sleeves. His face held that particular brand of earnest concern that only children can achieve, worry without judgment, sadness at witnessing pain without understanding its source. Sean's throat closed up entirely because kindness from strangers always undid him in ways cruelty never could, breaking through defenses he'd spent decades perfecting. The boy tilted his head, studying Sean with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that adults had deemed unsolvable. His cheeks were pink from cold, nose running slightly in the way all children's noses run during winter, completely unaware of how vulnerable he was approaching a stranger. If the boy's mother knew who Sean actually was, she'd snatch her child away with the kind of protective horror that confirmed everything Sean believed about his own toxicity. But the boy saw only a sad man on a bench, a problem to be solved, a person in need of help, rather than someone to fear. The simplicity of that perception made Sean's chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. He opened his mouth to send the child away, to protect him from proximity to someone like Sean, but no sound emerged except a rough exhale that turned to mist in frozen air. The boy stepped closer, eliminating the distance Sean's position and reputation usually maintained automatically, entering personal space as if it didn't exist. "Don't cry, mister," the boy said with absolute conviction, as if sadness could be solved through simple instruction. His voice carried that particular clarity children possess before life teaches them that some problems don't have solutions, pure and unguarded in its concern. Sean blinked, trying to process being addressed so directly, trying to remember when anyone had last spoken to him with such uncomplicated worry for his well-being. The boy's small hand reached out and patted Sean's knee with clumsy gentleness that landed heavier than the gesture warranted. His expression brightened with the solution he'd discovered, confidence radiating from every inch of his small frame. "You can borrow my mom," the boy continued, words tumbling out with the enthusiasm of someone sharing treasure. "She's really good at making people feel better. She gives the best hugs, and she always has cookies." The offer hung in frozen air between them, so pure and unexpected that Sean couldn't formulate a response adequate to match its simple generosity. This child was offering to share his mother, his cookies, his capacity for comfort, to a complete stranger crying on a park bench without asking for anything in return. The concept of unconditional kindness had become so foreign to Sean's experience that he almost couldn't recognize it when confronted directly, like hearing a language he'd once known but forgotten. His world operated on leverage and exchange, the careful balance of owing and being owed, yet here was this small person extending help that required nothing except acceptance. The boy smiled, gap-toothed and genuine, completely unaware he'd just offered something more valuable than any deal Sean had ever negotiated. A sound escaped Sean's throat, half laugh and half sob, as he realized he was about to accept help from someone young enough to still believe in Santa Claus. "She's right over there," the boy added, pointing toward a woman in a cream-colored coat who stood near the hot chocolate vendor, her attention divided between watching her son and managing shopping bags. His finger jabbed enthusiastically at the air, mittens flapping with the motion. "Her name is Deborah. She's the best mom in the whole world. You can borrow her for a little while if you need to." The boy's confidence that his mother would simply go along with this plan spoke to a childhood filled with consistent warmth, the kind of secure attachment Sean had studied in psychology books, but never actually experienced firsthand. Envy mixed with something softer in his chest, not resentment, but wonder that such uncomplicated goodness could still exist in a world he'd always experienced as fundamentally cold. The woman, Deborah, noticed her son's absence, and her head snapped around with immediate maternal alertness, scanning until she located him standing far too close to a strange man. Her body language shifted instantly to protective as she started moving in their direction, abandoning her shopping to retrieve her child from potential danger. Sean should have stood up, created distance, demonstrated he wasn't a threat, but his legs wouldn't cooperate with the instruction. The boy waved enthusiastically at his mother, completely unaware of her concern, delighted to have found someone who needed the exact help he could provide. Mom, this man is sad and needs cookies," the boy called out, his voice carrying across the emptiness with devastating innocence. Deborah reached them in seconds, her hand immediately going to her son's shoulder in protective gesture that spoke volumes about good parenting and reasonable caution. Her eyes assessed Sean in one sweeping glance, taking in the expensive coat, the quality of his leather gloves, the tear tracks on his face that were rapidly freezing against his skin. Sean expected fear or disgust, the typical responses people had when confronted with vulnerability in public spaces, but her expression shifted through surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like understanding. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably right around 30, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held exhaustion and kindness in equal measure. Her coat, he noticed, was several years old and had been mended at one elbow, the kind of repair that spoke to budgets stretched thin but maintained with dignity. The boy looked between them with expectant excitement, completely confident his mother would solve this problem the way she solved all problems in his limited experience. Sean finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended, scratched raw by crying and cold. "I'm sorry," he managed, the words inadequate but necessary. "Your son is very kind. I didn't mean to worry you or take up his time." "Luke has a habit of adopting people," Deborah interrupted gently, her hand tightening on her son's shoulder in gesture that was protective and proud simultaneously. Her voice carried warmth that her caution couldn't fully suppress. Trained educator's tone that managed to be firm and compassionate at once. She studied Sean more carefully now, seeing past the expensive exterior to something underneath that apparently merited different treatment than her initial wariness suggested. Luke bounced slightly on his feet, mittens swinging as he looked between the two adults with the anticipation of someone watching their favorite plan come together. "He once tried to bring home a construction worker who looked tired," Deborah continued, slight smile touching her lips despite her obvious uncertainty about the situation. "And last month he insisted we share our umbrella with a businesswoman who'd forgotten hers. He's got a generous heart, sometimes more generous than is practical." The way Deborah described her son's generosity carried undertones of maternal pride, mixed with the exhaustion of someone constantly managing a child's impulses toward kindness in a world that didn't always reward such behavior. Sean recognized the careful balance she maintained, encouraging Luke's empathy while trying to teach appropriate caution, wanting him to stay good without becoming naive. It was the kind of nuanced parenting that required constant attention and adjustment, very different from the rigid rule-following that had characterized Sean's own childhood in institutional settings. He found himself respecting her approach, even as he worried that Luke's openness would eventually be crushed by reality's harshness, the way all beautiful things seemed to get destroyed by prolonged exposure to the world's indifference. Luke seemed oblivious to the adult tension crackling between his mother and the stranger he'd adopted, focused entirely on his mission to solve the sad man's problem through application of cookies and maternal affection. His mittens had fallen off the strings and now dangled from his sleeves like deflated balloons, forgotten in his enthusiasm for orchestrating this meeting. The gap in his front teeth gave his smile an endearing imperfection that Sean found himself unexpectedly moved by, this physical reminder of childhood's temporary nature. In a few years, those adult teeth would come in, and Luke would lose this particular charm, would grow into someone different, and Sean felt sudden urgency to be present for that transformation, to witness this remarkable child becoming whoever he was meant to be. The cafe's warmth had created condensation on the windows that distorted the outside world into impressionist painting, colors bleeding together in ways that made everything look softer, kinder than reality actually was. Other patrons glanced over occasionally with varying degrees of curiosity and approval, strangers witnessing what appeared to be family outing rather than the complex negotiation of boundaries it actually represented. Sean caught an elderly woman smiling at them from 2 tables over, her expression suggesting she'd drawn her own conclusions about their relationship, seen some heartwarming narrative that didn't match the truth, but wasn't entirely wrong either. The weight of performing normalcy pressed on him. Years of practice at wearing whatever mask the situation required now deployed to convince Deborah he was safe enough to be near her child. Money had always been Sean's primary language of generosity, the easiest way to demonstrate care without requiring emotional vulnerability or personal investment. He'd built a reputation among his people for taking care of their families, making sure medical bills got paid and kids got scholarships, acts of strategic kindness that built loyalty while maintaining professional distance. But watching Luke devour his cookie with unself-conscious joy, chocolate smeared across his cheek in ways that would have mortified any adult, Sean understood that his usual approach wouldn't work here. This child didn't need money, wasn't impressed by expensive gestures, valued only presence and attention. Currencies Sean had never learned to spend because they required giving parts of himself he'd learned to protect at all costs. The way she spoke about her son held affection that Sean recognized as the kind of love he'd spent his whole life searching for and never finding. Luke tugged on his mother's sleeve, urgent in the way only children can be when adults aren't moving fast enough. "But Mom, he really needs cookies. Look how sad he is. The chocolate chip ones will help, I promise." Deborah's expression softened further as she looked down at her son, then back at Sean with assessment that felt less like judgment and more like genuine concern. She seemed to make a decision, the kind that mothers make when balancing safety with teaching compassion, weighing risk against the lesson of kindness. "We were about to head to the cafe across the street to warm up," she said carefully, addressing Sean directly now. "You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Luke's right that the cookies are good, and it's too cold to be sitting out here alone." The invitation was simple, practical, offered without fanfare or expectation of anything in return, and it nearly broke Sean completely. He should decline, should maintain the distance that kept people safe from association with him. But the loneliness that had driven him to tears on this bench suddenly felt unbearable. "I don't want to intrude," he heard himself say, the protest automatic, even as every part of him screamed to accept what was being offered. "It's not intruding if you're invited," Deborah replied with the kind of gentle firmness that probably worked well in her classroom. She adjusted the shopping bags on her arm, practical movement that suggested the decision was already made. "Besides, Luke won't let either of us hear the end of it if we leave you here. He's stubborn when he thinks someone needs help." Luke nodded vigorously, his entire body involved in the agreement. "I get it from Mom," he announced proudly. "She's always helping people at school. Last week she stayed late every day to help Tommy learn his letters because he was feeling bad about being slow." The casual way he shared this information revealed more about Deborah's character than any formal introduction could have. Sean stood slowly, his body stiff from cold and emotion, and realized he was significantly taller than Deborah, which made her fearlessness in approaching him even more remarkable. She didn't flinch or step back, just shifted her weight slightly to better manage her bags and maintain her hold on Luke's shoulder. "I'm Sean," he offered, extending his hand in gesture that felt absurdly formal given the circumstances, but was the only social grace he could remember in the moment. "Deborah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand with grip that was surprisingly firm for someone with such gentle eyes. Her hand was cold despite the gloves she wore, fingers slightly rough in a way that spoke to work done with hands rather than just keyboards. "And this is Luke, as you've probably gathered. He's in 2nd grade and takes his mission of making people happy very seriously." Luke beamed at the description, clearly proud of his reputation. "Come on," he insisted, tugging at both adults now with the impatience of someone who'd achieved their goal and wanted to move to the next phase. "The cafe has hot chocolate, and the lady there always gives me extra marshmallows because she says I'm polite. You can have marshmallows too if you want, Mr. Sean." The addition of his name, spoken with such casual friendliness, made something twist in Sean's chest. He followed as Deborah allowed Luke to lead them across the park, toward warmth and light spilling from windows that promised temporary refuge. Snow continued to fall, softer now, as if the weather itself approved of this unlikely convergence, this moment where 3 people who should never have intersected found themselves walking together. The cafe was small and crowded, condensation fogging the windows and creating a barrier between inside warmth and outside cold. The smell of coffee and cinnamon hit Sean immediately, along with the sound of conversations layered over each other, humanity packed into a small space seeking comfort from winter. Luke navigated through the crowd with the confidence of a regular, pulling them toward a corner table that had just been vacated. Deborah unloaded her shopping bags onto an empty chair, movements efficient in the way of someone accustomed to managing limited resources and even more limited time. "What would you like?" she asked Sean, already reaching for her wallet despite the obvious strain that gesture represented. "Coffee, tea, hot chocolate?" "Luke's going to order the cookies regardless of what I say, so you might as well choose something to go with them." "I'll get it," Sean said quickly, the words coming out more forcefully than intended. He pulled out his wallet, leather smooth and expensive, filled with cards that could purchase this entire cafe without making a dent in his accounts. "Please, it's the least I can do for your kindness, for both of you." Deborah hesitated, pride warring with practicality across her features, before nodding acceptance. "Hot chocolate for Luke, coffee for me, black with 1 sugar," she said, conceding with grace that suggested she knew how to receive help without letting it diminish her dignity. "And thank you. That's generous." Luke had already claimed a seat, bouncing slightly as he pulled off his mittens and beanie, revealing brown hair that stuck up in all directions from static. "Don't forget the cookies, Mr. Sean," he called out, stage whisper loud enough that several nearby patrons smiled. "The chocolate chip ones in the case. 3 of them, so we each get 1. Sean approached the counter, aware of how out of place he looked in this neighborhood cafe with his tailored coat and obvious wealth. The barista, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair and a name tag reading Sarah, took his order without judgment, just professional efficiency. He added a 4th cookie to the request, some instinct suggesting that abundance might matter to a child who clearly understood scarcity. While waiting for the drinks, he observed Deborah and Luke through the crowd, the way she helped him unzip his jacket and smoothed his hair with automatic maternal gestures. She said something that made Luke laugh, his whole face transforming with joy, and Sean felt the weight of witnessing something sacred. This was what family looked like, the casual intimacy he'd spent decades pretending not to want. The order came up quickly, Sarah arranging everything on a tray with practiced ease. Sean carried it back carefully, navigating through tight spaces between tables, hyper-aware of not spilling anything. Luke's eyes widened when he saw 4 cookies instead of 3, his delight so pure and unguarded that several people at neighboring tables smiled reflexively. "You got an extra one," Luke announced, as if Sean might not have noticed. His small hands reached for the plate, then stopped, looking up at his mother for permission that she granted with a slight nod. "That's really nice, Mr. Sean. Now we can save one for later if we get full, or we can share it with someone else who looks sad." Deborah accepted her coffee with quiet thanks, wrapping both hands around the cup as if drawing warmth through ceramic into frozen fingers. She studied Sean over the rim, assessment continuing, but without the hardness that often accompanied evaluation. "So what brings you to the park alone on a Tuesday afternoon?" she asked gently. "If you don't mind my asking." Luke's curiosity is genetic, I'm afraid. The question was casual but probing, offered with enough lightness that Sean could deflect if he chose to, and something about that freedom made honesty feel possible. "I was supposed to meet someone," he said slowly, crafting truth that omitted dangerous details. "Business associate. They canceled last minute, and I just stayed there instead of going back to work. I don't know why. I think I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't my office." Luke nodded seriously, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Sometimes Mom sits in her car for 10 minutes before we go inside after school," he offered, completely unaware he was sharing anything private. "She says she needs to be quiet before she can be loud again. I think sitting is important." Deborah's cheeks colored slightly, embarrassment at being exposed, mixing with obvious affection for her son's observant nature. "Teaching second grade requires a lot of energy," she explained to Sean. "Those 10 minutes help me transition from teacher mode to mom mode." Luke's right, though. Sometimes we need to just be still. The coffee warmed Sean from the inside, rich and strong, better than anything his expensive espresso machine produced because it came with context, with moment, with connection. "You're a teacher," he said, latching onto the information. "How long have you been doing that?" 8 years, Deborah replied, relaxing slightly as conversation shifted to safer territory. "I started right out of college. Always knew I wanted to work with kids. The pay isn't great and the hours are long, but watching them learn, seeing the moment when something clicks, there's nothing else like it." Luke was working on his cookie with focused dedication, chocolate already smeared at the corner of his mouth. "Mom's the best teacher," he announced between bites. "All the kids love her. Even the ones who are mean sometimes stop being mean in her class because she's nice to them anyway." The simple statement revealed volumes about Deborah's teaching philosophy, about the kind of person who chose kindness as consistent strategy rather than conditional response. Sean found himself wanting to know more, wanting to understand how someone maintained that openness in a world that punished vulnerability. "That's a gift," he said quietly. "Being able to reach kids that others have given up on." Deborah shrugged, deflecting the compliment with practiced humility. "Every child deserves someone who believes in them," she said, conviction clear in her voice. "Sometimes they just need one person to see past the behavior to the hurt underneath. Kids act out for reasons. Our job is to figure out what they need, not just punish what they do." Her words landed with unexpected weight, describing exactly what young Sean had needed and never received in his rotation through foster homes and group facilities. He wondered what his life might have looked like if he'd encountered a teacher like Deborah, someone who saw past his defensive anger to the abandoned child beneath. "You're right," he managed, voice rougher than intended. "That changes everything for a kid." Luke finished his cookie and immediately reached for his hot chocolate, marshmallows bobbing on the surface like tiny life rafts. "Are you still sad, Mr. Sean?" he asked, with direct concern that adults learn to hide behind social conventions. "Because you can have half my cookie too if it helps. Sharing makes everything better." The offer, made so freely, nearly undid Sean again. "I'm feeling better," he assured the boy, and realized with surprise that it was true. The ache hadn't disappeared. The loneliness still lived in his chest like a permanent resident, but something about this interaction had shifted, created crack where light could enter. "Your cookie and your company both help." "Thank you, Luke." Deborah watched this exchange with thoughtful expression, seeing something that made her posture relax further. "Luke believes everyone deserves kindness," she said softly. "I try not to discourage that even though the world isn't always safe. It's a balance, teaching him to be good while also teaching him to be careful." "You're doing well at both," Sean observed, meaning it completely. Luke was cautious enough to get his mother, trusting enough to offer help, exactly the balance that would serve him well in navigating complexity as he grew. He's remarkable. You both are. The conversation drifted to easier topics, Luke telling elaborate stories about his school day, Deborah adding context and gentle corrections when his narrative enthusiasm outpaced accuracy. Sean found himself laughing, actual genuine laughter that felt rusty and new, muscles in his face moving in patterns they'd forgotten. The cafe noise wrapped around them like insulation, creating bubble of temporary belonging. Luke's storytelling style involved elaborate hand gestures and frequent tangents, narrative structure that would have driven Sean's business mind crazy in any other context, but here felt charming and authentic. He described his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, with the kind of detailed observation only children achieve, noting that she always wore purple on Thursdays, and that her voice got squeaky when she was excited about something. His best friend Tyler apparently had a pet hamster that escaped twice a week, and Luke found this hilarious in ways that suggested he didn't fully grasp the stress this caused Tyler's parents. Deborah interjected occasionally with reality checks that Luke accepted with minimal protest, their dynamic revealing years of practiced communication patterns built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Watching them interact revealed layers of Deborah's character that her initial wariness had hidden, the way she balanced structure with flexibility, how she corrected without diminishing, the subtle ways she guided Luke's energy rather than trying to suppress it. She caught Sean observing her, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement of interest that made her cheeks color slightly before she looked away. The attraction was mutual and obvious, complicated by Luke's presence and by the vast differences in their circumstances, but undeniable nonetheless. Sean found himself wondering what it would be like to be part of this unit permanently, to have his mornings include Luke's breakfast chaos, and his evenings involve helping with homework, domestic routines that seemed simultaneously mundane and impossibly precious. The other cafe patrons had changed during their extended stay. Lunch crowd replaced by afternoon coffee drinkers and people working on laptops, the energy shifting from social to productive. A barista began wiping down empty tables, not rushing them but signaling that their extended occupation of premium seating was noted. Sean noticed Deborah register this too, her awareness of social expectations and limited welcome showing in the way she began gathering napkins and organizing the debris of their meal. He wanted to tell her they could stay as long as they wanted, that he'd buy the entire cafe if necessary to preserve this moment, but recognized that such gestures would only highlight the economic disparity that already created tension between them. Luke had moved on to describing his plans for using the art supplies, specifically a series of superhero drawings he intended to create, each hero having powers based on different animals. His enthusiasm was infectious, vision unconstrained by concerns about technical ability or artistic convention, pure creative joy that adults learn to temper with realism and self-doubt. Sean listened with the same attention he gave to business proposals worth millions, treating Luke's artistic ambitions with the seriousness they deserved rather than the patronizing dismissal adults often showed children's dreams. He asked questions about character backstories and power limitations, engaging with the creative process in ways that made Luke's eyes light up with the recognition that someone was taking him seriously as an artist and thinker. An hour passed without Sean noticing, the kind of time that disappeared when engagement replaced obligation. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but he ignored it, choosing presence over productivity in a decision that would have shocked his associates. Luke eventually started yawning, energy depleting as sugar high faded, and Deborah checked her watch with visible reluctance. "We should get going," she said, regret clear in her voice. "Luke has school tomorrow and I have evening papers to grade. But this was really nice. Thank you for the coffee and cookies, Sean, and for being kind to Luke's intervention." Sean stood as they gathered their things, helping Deborah with her shopping bags in automatic gesture of courtesy. "Thank you for not calling security when your son approached a strange man crying on a bench," he said, attempting lightness while meaning every word. "This afternoon meant more than you probably realize." Luke looked up at him, sleepy but satisfied, and held out his small hand for a handshake like he'd seen adults do. Sean took it carefully, this tiny hand in his larger one, feeling the trust and innocence in that gesture. "You're not strange, Mr. Sean," Luke announced with conviction. "You're just sad. But that's okay because now you have friends. Friends help with sad." The statement was so simple and so profound that Sean couldn't formulate an adequate response. Deborah smiled, sad and sweet simultaneously, and touched Sean's arm briefly. "He's right, you know. Everyone needs someone. Take care of yourself, Sean." They left, mother and son disappearing into the evening crowd, and Sean stood watching through the foggy window as they walked away into the snow. Something fundamental had shifted inside him, crack widening into possibility, loneliness touched by warmth he hadn't known he could still feel. He pulled out his phone finally, scrolled through the urgent messages, and felt their importance diminish in the wake of what had just transpired. Sean returned to his penthouse that night, and couldn't settle into his usual routine of reviewing reports and planning tomorrow's moves. The apartment felt larger than before, emptier, its expensive minimalist design suddenly appearing sterile rather than sophisticated. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, watching lights blink in patterns that represented lives he'd never touch, families he'd never join. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked successful, but felt hollowed out, and for the first time in years, he let himself acknowledge the cost of his choices. The empire he'd built required isolation as foundation, demanded emotional distance as price for power. Every connection was strategic, every relationship transactional, and until this afternoon he'd believed that was simply how the world worked for men like him. The penthouse's smart home system had dimmed the lights automatically as evening progressed, sensors detecting his presence and adjusting environment to preferences he'd programmed years ago when efficiency seemed more important than atmosphere. Now the calculated ambiance felt like living inside an algorithm, every comfort anticipated and provided without requiring him to express actual needs or desires. His refrigerator was stocked by a service that knew his preferences, his closet organized by another service that coordinated his wardrobe, his entire existence managed by hired professionals who ensured he never had to think about domestic concerns. The convenience that had once seemed like ultimate luxury now felt like another symptom of his disconnection from ordinary human experience, from the simple act of choosing what to eat or wear based on mood rather than optimization. He'd built this life with intention, every choice designed to maximize efficiency and minimize emotional complications, operating under the belief that success required sacrifice of the kind of messy human connections that slowed other people down. His competitors had families that demanded attention, children's sports games and school plays that pulled focus from business at critical moments, wives who called during negotiations with complaints about household problems. Sean had watched them struggle to balance competing demands and felt superior in his unencumbered state, free to work 18-hour days and travel at moment's notice because no one depended on him personally. That freedom had seemed like competitive advantage, proof that his early losses had taught him valuable lessons about staying lean and mobile in cutthroat world. But standing in his temperature-controlled apartment watching the city lights blink in patterns that meant nothing to him personally, Sean recognized his perceived advantage as elaborate defense mechanism. He hadn't chosen independence. He'd chosen protection from the vulnerability that connection required, mistaking isolation for strength and loneliness for freedom. The realization didn't arrive with dramatic clarity, but rather as slow recognition of truth he'd been avoiding, the way morning light gradually reveals details hidden by darkness. His success was real, his accomplishments genuine, but they'd been motivated by running away rather than moving toward anything, building empire as shield against the kind of rejection and abandonment that had defined his formative years. The contracts spread across his dining table represented millions in pending deals, decisions that would affect dozens of families whose livelihoods depended on his business acumen and strategic planning. He'd always taken that responsibility seriously, prided himself on taking care of his people even while maintaining emotional distance, believing that competent leadership was its own form of caring. But Luke's simple offer to share his mother had revealed the hollowness of that rationalization, the difference between being useful and being loved, between being respected and being known. A child had seen through his expensive armor to the loneliness underneath within minutes of meeting him, had offered uncomplicated compassion without needing to understand the causes of his pain, had demonstrated the kind of emotional generosity Sean had spent decades believing didn't actually exist outside fairy tales and manipulation. Luke's voice echoed in his memory, that simple declaration that sharing makes everything better, and Sean wondered when he'd stopped believing in that kind of basic human truth. His phone sat on the marble counter, silent now after he'd delegated tomorrow's decisions to his second-in-command. The freedom to step back felt strange and slightly terrifying, like removing armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten what skin felt like underneath. Sleep came poorly, filled with fragmented dreams of park benches and chocolate chip cookies, of small hands offering comfort he didn't know how to accept. He woke at dawn feeling unrested but strangely compelled, driven by impulse he couldn't name or dismiss. The morning routine of expensive coffee and financial news felt inadequate, missing something he couldn't articulate but desperately wanted. By 10 o'clock, he found himself back at Riverside Park, sitting on the same bench, though he had no logical reason to be there. The lake remained frozen, snow from yesterday unmarked except for bird tracks forming delicate patterns across white surface. He wasn't waiting for anything specific, just existing in space where something meaningful had happened, hoping lightning might strike twice. Luke appeared around 11, recognition lighting his face like sunrise when he spotted Sean on the bench. "Mr. Sean," he called out, running ahead of his mother with the fearless enthusiasm of children who haven't learned that the world disappoints. "You came back. Mom said maybe you would, but I wasn't sure. Did you come to see us?" Deborah followed more slowly, surprise evident in her expression, but not displeasure. Caution present but tempered by something that looked like cautious hope. She carried a thermos and wore the same mended coat, hair pulled back in identical ponytail, and Sean realized she probably dressed this way every day. Practicality prioritized over vanity. "This is unexpected," she said, statement rather than question, giving him space to explain without demanding it. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday," Sean admitted, honesty coming easier in daylight than it would have in his office surrounded by people who expected calculated precision. "About what Luke said, about sharing and friends. I haven't had a real conversation in longer than I can remember. Everything is business. I just wanted to feel that again." Luke plopped down on the bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, completely comfortable with proximity that adults spent years learning to maintain. "That's really sad, Mr. Sean," he announced with blunt compassion. "Everybody needs friends. Mom says friends are like family you choose. Are you choosing us?" The question hung between them, impossibly direct in the way only children can manage, cutting through social convention to the heart of what Sean wanted, but couldn't quite say. Deborah sat on Luke's other side, creating a chain of 3 people on cold iron, and poured hot chocolate from her thermos into a cup she offered to Sean. "Luke's not wrong," she said softly, though he could use some work on subtlety. Sean accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, and felt warmth that had nothing to do with the liquid inside. "I would like that," he heard himself say, words emerging before strategy could censor them. "To choose you, both of you, if that's not too strange or too much to ask from people I barely know." Deborah studied him with those kind, tired eyes, seeing something that made her decision shift visibly across her features. "Everyone starts as strangers before they become anything else," she replied, gentle wisdom in her voice. "Luke's a good judge of character. If he thinks you're worth befriending, I'm inclined to trust that. But I need to know you're serious, that this isn't just loneliness talking that will disappear when you feel better." The challenge was fair, her maternal protection evident, and entirely appropriate, and Sean respected her for establishing boundaries even while opening doors. "I'm serious," he promised, meeting her gaze directly. "I can't explain why this matters so much except to say that yesterday was the first time in 15 years I felt like a person instead of a position. I want more of that. I want to learn how to do this." Luke bounced excitedly, hot chocolate sloshing dangerously in the thermos cap he'd claimed for himself. "We can teach you," he announced with absolute confidence. "Mom's really good at helping people learn things. She helped me learn to tie my shoes even though it took forever. Friendship is probably easier than shoe tying." The simple comparison made both adults smile, tension breaking into something lighter, and Deborah laughed quietly. "I'm not sure friendship is easier than shoe tying, sweetheart, but we can certainly try," she told her son before returning attention to Sean. "Fair warning, though, we're not exciting people. Our life is pretty ordinary. School and work and trying to make ends meet. If you're looking for entertainment, you'll be disappointed." "Ordinary sounds perfect," Sean said, meaning it with intensity that surprised even him. His life was nothing but extraordinary in the worst ways, constant calculation and risk, and the weight of decisions that affected dozens of people's livelihoods. The idea of ordinary afternoons and simple conversations felt like luxury his money couldn't buy. "I'm not looking for entertainment. I'm looking for real." They stayed in the park for 2 hours, Luke chattering about everything and nothing, Deborah adding context and gentle guidance when his stories became too elaborate. Sean mostly listened, absorbing the rhythm of their interaction, the way they communicated through looks and touches, the casual affection that required no performance. At some point, Deborah mentioned needing to stop at the library for books Luke needed for a school project, and Sean found himself offering to drive them, wanting to extend this pocket of normalcy as long as possible. His car made Deborah pause, the sleek black Mercedes so obviously expensive that it created visible tension. "Sean," she said carefully, reassessing in ways that made his stomach tighten. "What exactly do you do for a living? That's not a car someone drives on a teacher's salary or anywhere close to it." The moment of truth arrived faster than he'd hoped, unavoidable and potentially relationship ending before the relationship properly began. "I run a consulting firm," he said, truth wrapped in vague corporate language that wasn't technically a lie. "Risk management and strategic planning. It's profitable but not particularly interesting to talk about." Deborah's expression suggested she heard what he wasn't saying, intelligence behind her gentleness catching the evasion, even if she couldn't identify its exact nature. "As long as it's legal and doesn't hurt people," she said finally, setting boundaries that made his chest tighten with guilt he had no right to feel. "I don't care about money. I care about character. Luke's already attached to you. I need to know we're safe." "You're safe," Sean promised, and meant it absolutely, even as he recognized the irony that his world's definition of legal existed in gray spaces most people never contemplated. "I would never let anything touch you or Luke. That's a promise I can make and keep." Luke had already climbed into the back seat, marveling at the leather interior and the screens built into the headrests, his delight uncomplicated by adult concerns about wealth disparity or hidden dangers. Deborah got in more slowly, running her hand along the dashboard with expression that mixed appreciation and discomfort. "This is a lot," she murmured. "I'm not sure we fit in your world, Sean." "I don't fit in my world either," he replied, starting the engine with quiet purr of expensive machinery. "That's the problem. Maybe we can figure out a new world that works for all of us." The library trip was unremarkable in the best possible way, Luke dragging them through children's section while explaining his project on Arctic animals with passionate enthusiasm. Sean found himself carrying books, offering opinions on penguin versus polar bear superiority, feeling lighter than he had in years. Deborah watched him with Luke, assessment ongoing, but softening, and at one point touched his arm briefly in gesture of approval that meant more than any business success ever had. 3 weeks passed in pattern that felt both surreal and more real than anything Sean had experienced in his adult life. He met Deborah and Luke at the park every Wednesday and Saturday, the standing appointments appearing in his calendar between strategy meetings and territory negotiations. His associates noticed the change, whispered among themselves about the boss's new distraction, but no one dared question him directly about where he disappeared to twice weekly with phone turned off. Marco cornered him after a Friday meeting, concern evident beneath professional courtesy. "You good, boss?" he asked carefully, loyal lieutenant who'd earned the right to express worry. "You've been different lately. Distracted. Some of the guys are wondering if there's a problem we should know about." Sean considered his response, weighing honesty against operational security, and settled on partial truth. "I'm fine, Marco. Better than fine, actually. I've been spending time with someone. A woman and her kid. Nothing that affects business." The words felt strange in his mouth, reducing something precious to categories his world understood. But Marco's face relaxed with visible relief. "That's good, boss. Real good," Marco said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "You've been alone too long. Everyone needs somebody. Just be careful, yeah? Our world isn't always safe for the people we care about. You know that better than anyone." The warning was unnecessary and entirely accurate. Fear Sean carried constantly now that he had something to lose. He'd already stationed 2 of his most trusted men in rotating surveillance around Deborah's apartment and Luke's school, protection they'd never notice, but that let Sean sleep at night. The moral contradiction of using criminal resources to protect innocent people from criminals didn't escape him, but practicality won over philosophical consistency. Luke's birthday arrived on a Thursday, and Deborah mentioned it casually during their Wednesday park meeting. Not invitation, but information shared between friends. "He's turning 8, she said, watching Luke feed ducks at the lake's edge with stale bread she'd brought in a paper bag. "I'm doing a small party at our apartment Saturday afternoon. Just a few kids from school and cake. Nothing fancy." The lack of explicit invitation stung, until Sean recognized it as Deborah's way of giving him out, not assuming he'd want to attend a children's birthday party when his Saturdays could be spent on anything else. "What time?" he asked, refusing the exit she'd offered. "And what does Luke want for a gift? I'd like to come if that's okay." Deborah turned to face him fully, surprise and something deeper swimming in her expression. 2 o'clock, she said slowly. "And Sean, you don't have to bring anything expensive. Luke would be happy with a card and your presence. He talks about you constantly. You've become really important to him." The weight of that statement settled over Sean like physical pressure. Responsibility and privilege intertwined in ways that terrified and exhilarated simultaneously. "He's important to me too," he admitted, vulnerability making his voice rough. "You both are. I know that's probably too much too fast, but it's true. This is the first time in my life I've felt like I belong somewhere." Deborah reached out and took his hand. Simple gesture that sent electricity up his arm. Her fingers cold from winter air, but grip firm and intentional. "It's not too much," she said quietly. "It's actually really nice. Luke needs positive male influence. His father left before he was born. Never been part of his life. Watching you with him, seeing how patient you are, how you actually listen when he talks, it means everything." The revelation about Luke's father explained certain things. The way Deborah carried herself with defensive independence, the fierceness with which she protected her son, the careful way she evaluated Sean's intentions. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "His loss. Luke is extraordinary because you made him that way." "We're doing okay," Deborah replied, deflecting praise the way she always did, uncomfortable with acknowledgement of her own strength. "It's hard sometimes, money-wise and just managing everything alone, but we have each other. That's what matters. Though having you around has been really good for both of us. You've brought something into our lives I didn't know we were missing." Luke ran back to them, breathless and pink-cheeked, and immediately noticed their held hands. His eyes widened with delight, gap-toothed smile spreading across his face. "Are you guys holding hands?" he asked with the volume control of someone who hadn't learned indoor voices applied to personal observations. "Does that mean you like each other? Tommy's mom holds hands with her boyfriend and they kiss sometimes." Deborah released Sean's hand quickly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks, but Sean found himself laughing at Luke's directness. "We're friends, Luke," Deborah explained with practiced patience. "Friends can hold hands too. It doesn't always mean romance." "But it could," Luke persisted, undeterred by his mother's attempt at correction. "I think it would be really cool if Mr. Sean was around all the time. Then I'd have a mom and a dad, sort of. And we could do stuff together like other families do." The longing in his voice cut through both adults, innocent desire for completeness that neither could immediately address. Sean looked at Deborah and saw his own complicated feelings reflected, the impossibility of the situation weighing against the reality of what was developing between them. "Let's not rush things, buddy," Sean said gently, "but I promise I'll be around as much as your mom lets me. Deal?" Saturday arrived with the kind of nervous energy Sean usually reserved for major business negotiations, ridiculous given the context of a child's birthday party. He'd agonized over the gift, rejecting expensive electronics and designer clothes in favor of something more meaningful. The wrapped package in his passenger seat contained a high-quality art set, the kind with real brushes and professional-grade colored pencils, because Luke had mentioned wanting to draw like the artist whose work hung in the library. Deborah's apartment was in a working-class neighborhood Sean's people occasionally operated in. 3-story building with paint peeling near the gutters and playground equipment showing its age. He parked his Mercedes a block away, suddenly conscious of how the car would stand out, potentially creating questions he wasn't ready to answer. The walk gave him time to settle nerves, to remember he was attending a child's party, not walking into territory negotiation. The apartment door was slightly ajar, sounds of children's laughter spilling into the hallway, and Sean knocked softly before entering. The space was small but meticulously maintained, furniture worn but clean, walls covered with Luke's artwork and educational posters. Deborah appeared from the kitchen wearing a flour-dusted apron, hair escaping its ponytail in ways that made her look softer, more approachable, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with styling or expense. "You came," she said, relief and pleasure mixing in her expression. "Luke's been watching the door for 20 minutes. He's in his room showing the other kids his rock collection. Go on back. Second door on the left." Luke's room was chaos of happy children, 6 kids ranging in age from 7 to 9, all talking over each other with that particular energy only children possess. Luke spotted Sean immediately and launched himself forward, arms wrapping around Sean's waist with unself-conscious affection. "You're here. I told everyone you'd come. This is Mr. Sean. He's my friend who's really important and has a really cool car." The other children stared with varying degrees of curiosity and shyness, and Sean found himself suddenly responsible for entertaining an audience he had no experience with. "Happy birthday, Luke," he managed, offering the wrapped package. "I hope you like it." Luke tore into the wrapping with enthusiasm that made careful preservation impossible, paper flying everywhere, and his gasp when he saw the art set made every minute of Sean's agonizing over the choice worth it. "Mom! Mom! Come look!" he yelled, clutching the box like treasure. "Mr. Sean got me real art supplies, the kind actual artists use." And Deborah appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene, and her eyes met Sean's with emotion that made his throat tight. "That's incredibly thoughtful," she said softly, words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. "Luke's wanted something like that for months. Thank you, Sean. Really." The party continued with typical childhood chaos, cake consumption, and present opening, and games that Sean found himself participating in, despite complete lack of experience. At some point, he ended up on the floor helping Luke and his friends build an elaborate block tower, his expensive suit jacket discarded on a chair, tie loosened, more relaxed than he'd been in any business meeting ever. Deborah moved through the space managing crises and facilitating joy, and Sean watched her with growing certainty that he was falling for her in ways that would complicate everything. The block tower reached impressive height before physics and enthusiastic 8-year-old construction methods caused its inevitable collapse, sending wooden pieces scattering across the worn carpet an explosion of color and sound. Luke's friend Maya declared it the best destruction ever, her assessment delivered with authority that suggested she was connoisseur of structural failures, and the other children agreed with vigorous nodding. Sean found himself grinning at their pure joy in chaos, this celebration of temporary creation and spectacular destruction that would have horrified his carefully controlled business associates. He'd spent decades building things meant to last, establishing systems designed for permanence and growth, but these children understood something he'd forgotten about: the pleasure in ephemeral moments, in building something beautiful, knowing it would fall, and finding that perfectly acceptable. Deborah appeared with a camera, capturing images of the party with the dedication of someone who understood these moments passed quickly and became precious in retrospect. She photographed Luke with his friends, Luke with his cake, Luke opening presents with expressions ranging from delight to polite confusion, building archive of childhood that could be referenced in future years. When she turned the camera toward Sean sitting among the children surrounded by scattered blocks, he instinctively moved to block his face before stopping himself, recognizing this impulse came from years of avoiding documentation that could be used against him. But this wasn't surveillance or evidence gathering. This was memory preservation, and he forced himself to smile naturally while she captured him in this unlikely domestic scene, creating proof that he'd been present for something that mattered beyond profit margins and strategic positioning. The tower collapsed with spectacular destruction, children shrieking with laughter, and in the chaos Sean's phone rang with Marco's specific ringtone reserved for emergencies. He stepped into the hallway to answer, immediately shifting into the other version of himself that handled crises and made hard decisions. "What is it?" he said quietly, aware of children's voices filtering through the door behind him. "We have a situation with the Castellano shipment," Marco said urgently. "Someone tipped off customs. The whole thing's locked down. We need you to make a call, boss. Tonight. Can't wait until Monday." Sean closed his eyes, torn between the world inside the apartment and the world demanding his attention through the phone. "I can't leave right now, Marco. Handle it. Use the backup route we discussed last month. You have authority to make that call." Silence on the other end spoke volumes about how unusual that response was. "Boss, this is a $250,000 problem. You sure you want me making that decision without you?" "I'm sure," Sean said firmly. "You're capable. Handle it. I'll check in tomorrow." He ended the call before Marco could protest further, before his own resolve could weaken, and returned to the apartment to find Luke showing his friends the art supplies with pride that made Sean's chest ache. The party wound down as parents arrived to collect their children, and soon only Sean remained, helping Deborah clean up the considerable mess 8-year-olds could generate. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who've moved past needing to fill every moment with words. Luke had crashed on the couch, sugar coma claiming him mid-sentence while describing his favorite presents. "Thank you for being here," Deborah said, scraping frosting off plates into the trash. It meant the world to him. To both of us, honestly. This was his best birthday yet. He said so right before he passed out. Sean dried dishes she handed him. Domestic task so far from his usual life, it felt like visiting another planet. "Thank you for inviting me," he replied. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself this much. Actually, I don't think I ever have. This was perfect." Deborah paused, studying him with that penetrating gaze that always made him feel transparent. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. "And will you be honest with me even if the truth is complicated?" His stomach tightened with anticipation of questions he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "I'll try," he said, refusing to promise complete honesty when partial truth was the best he could offer without destroying everything. "Who are you really, Sean?" she asked quietly. "The car, the phone call you just took where you made a $250,000 decision like it was nothing, the way you sometimes get this look like you're calculating 10 steps ahead. You're not just a consultant. I'm not stupid. I need to know what we're getting into." The moment of truth arrived with terrifying inevitability, and Sean set down the dish towel with careful precision, buying seconds to formulate response that wouldn't be lie but couldn't be complete truth. "I'm someone who's built a successful business through morally gray methods," he said slowly. "I'm not going to pretend I'm a saint or that everything I do would look good in daylight. But I've never hurt anyone who didn't come for me first, and I keep my people safe and prosperous." Deborah processed his words carefully, fear and understanding battling across her features in ways that made Sean want to take everything back and start over. "Morally gray," she repeated, testing the phrase like it might reveal hidden meaning through repetition. "That's a careful way of saying you operate outside the law. That's what you're telling me, isn't it?" The directness left no room for evasion, and Sean found himself respecting her for demanding clarity even as panic rose in his chest. "Yes," he admitted, the single word carrying weight of confession. "I won't lie to you about that, but I meant what I said about keeping you and Luke safe. My world doesn't have to touch yours." "Except it already has," Deborah said, not angry but stating fact with teacher's precision. "Luke talks about you constantly. He's drawn pictures of the three of us together. He asked me yesterday if you might be his dad someday. Your world is already in our apartment, Sean. The question is whether it's safe for us to let it stay." The revelation about Luke's pictures and questions made Sean's heart constrict painfully, desire and guilt twisting together until he couldn't separate them. "I would die before letting anything happen to either of you," he said with intensity that bordered on violent, then immediately regretted the phrasing given the context. "That's not hypothetical. I have resources, people, ways of ensuring your safety that go beyond anything normal life provides." Deborah moved to the window, looking out at the street below where families lived regular lives free from the complications Sean brought with him. "That's what scares me," she said quietly. "Not that you can't protect us, but that we might need protecting at all. Luke's already lost one father who chose not to be in his life. I can't let him get attached to someone who might disappear or worse because of the risks you take." The comparison to Luke's absent father landed like physical blow, categorizing Sean with someone who'd abandoned responsibility, rather than someone trying desperately to build connection he'd never had. "I'm not leaving," Sean said firmly, crossing to stand behind her without touching, close enough to feel her warmth. "That's the one promise I can make without reservation. Whatever else happens, I'm not walking away from you or Luke." "Can you promise you won't get arrested?" Deborah asked, still not turning around. "Can you promise you won't end up in a situation where your business gets you killed? Because those are the things that matter, Sean. Luke needs stability. He needs people who show up consistently, not someone exciting who might vanish tomorrow." The questions were impossible to answer with the certainty she deserved, and Sean felt the foundation of what they'd built start to crack under weight of reality. "I can't promise perfect safety," he admitted, honesty costing him everything. "No one can. Not really. But I can promise I'm careful, that I've survived 15 years in a dangerous world through intelligence and planning. I can promise that knowing you both has made me even more cautious, because now I have something worth staying alive for." Deborah finally turned, tears tracking down her cheeks that she didn't bother to hide, and Sean saw his own pain reflected in her expression. "I'm falling for you," she said, words carrying resignation rather than joy. "That's the problem. I look at you with Luke, and I see what we could be, what kind of family we could build, but I can't risk my son's heart on someone whose life operates in gray spaces I don't understand." "Then, let me explain it," Sean said urgently, desperate to prevent the ending he felt approaching. "Let me show you that my world isn't what you're imagining. I don't hurt innocent people. I don't deal drugs or weapons or anything that destroys lives. I facilitate business for people who can't use traditional banking systems. It's complicated and technically illegal, but it's not evil." The justification sounded weak even to his own ears. Rationalization he'd used for years suddenly inadequate when presented to someone whose moral clarity put his compromises in sharp relief. "I need time to think," Deborah said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "This is too much to process right now. Luke's birthday was perfect, and now I'm crying in my kitchen about things I don't understand. Can you just go? Please? Being dismissed felt like abandonment in reverse, and Sean wanted to argue, to convince her, to somehow make the impossibility of their situation resolve into happy ending through force of will. When can I see you again? He asked instead, maintaining distance she'd requested even as everything in him screamed to close it. Please don't shut me out completely. I don't know, Deborah said honestly. I need to figure out what's right for Luke. That has to come first, before what I want, or what you want. Give me a week. I'll call you. Sean left the apartment feeling like he was walking away from the only real thing he'd ever had, each step requiring conscious effort against the instinct to turn back. The hallway seemed longer than when he'd arrived hours ago, joy of the party replaced by hollow ache that no amount of business success had ever prepared him to handle. His phone showed missed calls from Marco, problems demanding attention, empire requiring decisions only he could make. He drove aimlessly through the city, instead of returning to his office, ending up at the park where this had all begun, sitting on the same bench where Luke had found him crying weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost that he'd come full circle, back to loneliness, but now it hurt worse because he knew what he was missing. The coffee cup he'd brought from a drive-thru went cold in his hands, untouched, while snow began falling again in patterns that matched his first meeting with Luke. The week Deborah requested stretched impossibly long, each day dragging while Sean threw himself into work with intensity that concerned his people. Marco finally confronted him Thursday afternoon, blocking his office door with crossed arms and expression that demanded explanation. "Boss, you're running yourself into the ground," he said bluntly. "Whatever's going on with that woman and her kid, you need to deal with it. This isn't sustainable." "She's scared of what I do," Sean admitted, exhaustion making honesty easier than deflection. "She's scared I'll hurt her kid by being in his life, and she's not wrong to be scared. Everything we do carries risk. I just never cared about that risk until now." Marco's expression softened into something approaching sympathy. "So what are you going to do about it?" he asked. Genuine question without obvious answer. "You can't change what we are, boss. This is the life. But maybe you can show her why it's worth the risk anyway." The suggestion planted seed that grew through the remaining days of Deborah's requested silence, idea forming about how to demonstrate his world, without exposing them to its dangers. Friday morning, he made calls, pulled favors, arranged something that would either bridge the gap between their realities or confirm its unbridgeable nature. By Saturday, he had a plan that terrified him because it required vulnerability he'd spent career avoiding, but Luke and Deborah were worth risks he'd never considered taking for himself. Sunday afternoon, his phone finally rang with Deborah's number, and his heart stopped before remembering to beat again. "Hi," he answered, carefully neutral, while everything inside him screamed desperation. "How are you?" "Confused," Deborah said, tiredness in her voice. "Luke keeps asking when you're coming over. I've tried explaining that adults sometimes need space, but he's 8. He doesn't understand why his friend disappeared. And honestly, Sean, neither do I. I asked for time to think and I've thought, but I keep coming back to the same place." "Which is?" Sean asked, not daring to hope while unable to stop hoping simultaneously. "That I don't want to do this without you," Deborah admitted, words rushing out like confession. "That life was smaller before you showed up, and going back to that smallness feels wrong even if it's safer. But I need to understand your world better. I need to see what I'm accepting if we move forward with this." Sean arrived at Deborah's apartment Tuesday evening as arranged, nerves making his usually steady hands uncharacteristically clumsy as he knocked. She opened the door wearing jeans and a sweater, casual clothes that somehow made her more beautiful than any designer outfit could have achieved. Luke appeared behind her immediately, launching himself at Sean with accusatory relief that would have been funny under different circumstances. "You were gone forever," Luke said, muffled against Sean's coat. "I thought maybe you got sick or had to go away for work. Mom said you were busy, but I thought maybe you decided not to be our friend anymore." The raw honesty of childhood fear cut deeper than any business betrayal ever had, and Sean knelt to meet Luke's eyes directly. "I will always be your friend," he promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Adults sometimes need time to figure things out, but that doesn't mean we stop caring. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Luke nodded seriously, accepting this explanation with resilience children somehow maintain, despite repeated disappointments. "Okay," he said simply. "I made you a drawing with the pencils you gave me. Want to see it?" He pulled Sean toward his room without waiting for answer, leaving Deborah watching with complicated expression that mixed relief and lingering concern. The drawing was crude but recognizable. 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun that took up quarter of the page, labeled Luke, Mom, and Sean in careful second-grade handwriting. Sean stared at it, feeling emotions he had no names for. This child's vision of family that included him rendered in primary colors an absolute conviction. "This is incredible, Luke," he managed, voice rougher than intended. "Can I keep it?" "Yeah, I made it for you," Luke replied, pleased by Sean's reaction. "So you remember we're your family even when you're at work doing important stuff. Mom says family remembers each other even when they're apart." After Luke went to bed, Sean and Deborah sat at her small kitchen table with tea. Neither of them drank, the silence heavy with everything unsaid during his absence. "I've been doing research," Deborah began carefully, fingers tracing patterns on her cup, "trying to understand what you do, what morally gray actually means in practical terms. I talked to a friend whose brother works in financial crimes. Off the record, theoretical conversation." Sean's stomach tightened, waiting for judgment he'd been expecting since their confrontation. "And what did you learn?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral while bracing for impact. "That there's a spectrum," Deborah said slowly. "That people in your world range from necessary evils to actual monsters, and the difference matters. That some of you provide services that should probably be legal but aren't because of outdated regulations and corporate lobbying. That you're likely somewhere in that gray area, facilitating financial transactions for people who can't use traditional banks." The accuracy of her assessment surprised him. Her ability to parse complexity, most people reduced to simple good versus evil narratives. "That's basically correct," he confirmed. "I move money for people who've made enemies of the traditional banking system. Sometimes they're criminals. Sometimes they're just inconvenient to powerful interests. I don't ask too many questions about the source as long as I know it's not trafficking or exploitation." Deborah absorbed this information, processing with the same careful attention she probably gave lesson planning. "My friend said people in your position either get out or get consumed," she said quietly. "That the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave because you know too much, and you've made too many enemies. Is that true?" "Yes," Sean admitted, honesty requiring he not minimize the reality she was accepting. "I've been thinking about exit strategies for years, but never had reason enough to actually implement one. The money's good, the challenge is interesting, and I had nothing else pulling me toward legitimate life. But that's changed now. You and Luke are reason enough. Don't make promises you can't keep," Deborah warned, but her hand reached across the table to cover his contact, offering hope despite her caution. "Bite. Don't tell me you'll change everything for us because that's too much pressure and probably not realistic. Just tell me you'll be careful. Tell me you'll prioritize staying alive and free over any business deal." Sean turned his hand to interlace their fingers, anchor point in conversation threatening to sweep him away. "I can promise that," he said firmly. "And I can promise something else. I want to introduce you to someone. One of my people. Marco. He's been with me 10 years. Former military. Has 3 kids of his own. I trust him completely. I want you to meet him so you can see that my world isn't just faceless criminals." The suggestion surprised them both, Sean's instinct for compartmentalization warring with desire to build bridge between his separate realities. "Why?" Deborah asked, not refusing but genuinely curious about his reasoning. "What difference does meeting your lieutenant make?" "Because you need to see I'm not alone in this," Sean explained, articulating understanding as he spoke. "That I have people who depend on me and who I depend on. Relationships that matter even if they're built in gray spaces. Marco talks about his kids the way you talk about your students. He's a good man doing questionable work for complex reasons. I want you to see that we're human, not monsters." Deborah considered this carefully, teacher's mind evaluating lesson plan for teaching her heart to accept what her mind found troubling. "Okay," she agreed finally, "but somewhere public. And Luke stays home with my neighbor. I'm not ready to mix those worlds yet." They met Marco Friday evening at a family restaurant, neither too upscale nor too casual, neutral territory where both worlds could coexist briefly. Marco arrived exactly on time, dressed in civilian clothes that made him look like any suburban father, and his handshake with Deborah was respectful without being deferential. "Ma'am," he said simply, "Boss says you're important to him. That makes you important to us." The dinner conversation was carefully managed, Marco sharing edited stories about his kids, while Deborah asked questions that revealed her intelligence without demanding dangerous specifics. At one point, Marco's phone rang with his daughter's ringtone. and his entire demeanor shifted into protective father mode that transcended his professional role. "Everything okay, sweetie?" he answered, and Deborah's expression softened, watching him navigate parental crisis involving forgotten permission slip, while simultaneously being the kind of man who probably intimidated people professionally. "You see what I mean?" Sean asked quietly, while Marco stepped outside to continue the call. "We're not what you probably imagined when you thought criminal organization. We're people trying to take care of our families using skills that happen to be illegal." "It's still illegal," Deborah pointed out, "but without the condemnation that might have accompanied those words weeks earlier. You're still taking risks that could destroy everything, but I see what you're showing me, that you're human, that your people care about more than just money. It helps, Sean. It doesn't solve everything, but it helps." Marco returned with apologies about parenting interrupting business, and Deborah surprised everyone by laughing. "That's just life with kids," she said warmly. "Emergencies at the worst possible times. Your daughter's lucky to have a dad who answers the phone no matter what else is happening." The evening ended with cautious optimism, Deborah accepting Sean's world enough to move forward, even if she couldn't embrace it completely. They walked to her car together, Marco having departed with promise to check in with Sean tomorrow about legitimate business matters. "Thank you for trying," Deborah said, pulling her coat tighter against March wind that carried hints of eventual spring. "For showing me this side of things. I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for giving me the chance," Sean replied, cupping her face gently with hands that had signed orders affecting thousands of lives, but had never touched anyone with this particular combination of tenderness and reverence. "I meant what I said about not leaving. Whatever happens, we figure it out together." She kissed him then, brief contact that promised more when timing was right, and Sean felt something slot into place that he hadn't known was missing. "Come over Sunday," she said, pulling back just far enough to speak. "Luke wants to show you how he's using the art supplies, and I want you there, officially, as someone who's part of our lives." Sunday afternoon arrived with spring sunshine that felt like blessing after months of winter, and Sean showed up with flowers for Deborah and new brushes for Luke, gifts that acknowledged the difference between them while honoring what each brought to his life. Luke's art had progressed remarkably in weeks since his birthday, walls now covered with drawings that showed improving technique and persistent theme of three figures together in various scenarios. They spent the afternoon drawing, Luke teaching Sean basic perspective while Deborah graded papers at the kitchen table, domestic tableau that Sean committed to memory like photograph he could reference during difficult times. At some point Luke declared him pretty good for a beginner, praise that made Sean prouder than any business accomplishment ever had, and Deborah laughed at his obvious pleasure in her son's approval. "You're good with him," she observed later, after Luke had been tucked into bed with promises Sean would be back Wednesday. They sat on her threadbare couch, her head resting on his shoulder, in comfortable intimacy that would have terrified him months ago. "He's thriving with you in his life, more confident, happier. I notice the difference every day." "He's saving my life," Sean replied honestly, arm tightening around her shoulders. "Both of you are. I was dying slowly before Luke found me in that park. Successfully dying, but dying nonetheless. You gave me reason to actually live instead of just surviving between business deals." 6 months passed in rhythm that felt both impossible and inevitable. Sean's two worlds existing in careful balance that required constant attention, but delivered rewards he'd never imagined. He'd begun distancing himself from riskier operations, delegating to Marco and others while he focused on legitimizing aspects of the business that could survive scrutiny. The transition wasn't simple or complete, but direction was clear, path toward cleaner life motivated by Sunday afternoons with Luke and stolen evenings with Deborah. Luke's 9th birthday party was larger than his 8th, circle of friends expanding to include Sean's goddaughter through Marco, connection between worlds that felt natural rather than forced. Deborah had relaxed enough to invite some of Sean's people to gatherings, carefully vetted individuals who understood importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. The artificial separation between lives was dissolving gradually, replaced by integrated existence that honored complexity rather than denying it. One Wednesday afternoon in September, Sean arrived at their usual park meeting to find Luke and Deborah already waiting, something electric in the air that made his protective instincts activate. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, scanning for threats his trained eye could identify and eliminate. "Did something happen?" "Nothing's wrong," Deborah said quickly, but her smile was too bright, compensating for nervousness he couldn't quite identify. "Luke has something he wants to ask you. We've been talking about it, and he's very certain, but I wanted him to be the one to ask." Luke stepped forward with the solemnity of someone carrying important responsibility, his 9-year-old face serious in ways that reminded Sean of himself at that age. "Mr. Sean," he began, using the formal address he'd maintained despite their closeness. "You've been coming to see us for a really long time now, and you make Mom happy, and you make me happy, and I think we make you happy too." "You do," Sean confirmed, something in his chest tightening with anticipation of whatever was coming. "You make me happier than I knew it was possible to be." "Then I want to ask if you'll be my dad," Luke said, words tumbling out in rush of courage. "Not like legally yet because Mom says that's complicated, but like really. I want to call you Dad instead of Mr. Sean. I want you to be my actual family, not just my friend. Is that okay?" The question landed with force that nearly buckled Sean's knees, 9 years of longing wrapped in child's hopeful request. He looked at Deborah, seeing her permission and her own hope reflected back, and realized they were offering him everything he'd ever wanted, but never believed he deserved. "Yes," he managed, voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, Luke. I would be honored to be your dad. I love you. I love both of you." Luke launched himself forward, arms wrapping around Sean's waist, while tears Sean had been holding back finally fell freely. Deborah joined them, her arms encompassing both, and for the first time in Sean's life, he understood what it meant to belong completely and unconditionally. The park where Luke had found him crying alone had become the site of his rebirth, transformation from isolated operator into someone capable of giving and receiving love without calculation. "I'm going to do better," Sean promised them both, speaking into Luke's hair while holding Deborah close. "I'm getting out of the gray spaces. It'll take time, but I'm building legitimate business that can support us without the risks. Marco's taking over the rest. I'm choosing this, choosing you, choosing the life we can build together. We'll figure it out together," Deborah said, using the phrase that had become their motto through months of navigating impossible situations. "That's what family does. We face things together, not alone." They stayed in the park until sunset painted the sky in colors that matched the artwork covering Luke's bedroom walls. 3 people who'd found each other against all odds, choosing to build something real from foundation of broken pieces. Sean thought about the man who'd sat crying on that bench 8 months ago, drowning in success that meant nothing, and felt grateful for the small boy who'd seen past the expensive coat to the lonely heart underneath. "Don't cry, Dad," Luke said, echoing his first words to Sean but with crucial difference. "We're all together now. There's no reason to be sad anymore." "These are happy tears," Sean explained, lifting Luke to sit on the bench between him and Deborah. "Sometimes people cry when they're so happy they don't know how else to express it. I spent my whole life thinking I'd always be alone, and you proved me wrong. You both proved me wrong." The bench that had held his loneliness now held his family, cold iron warmed by bodies pressed together against evening chill. Snow would come again soon, another winter in endless cycle. But Sean no longer feared the cold, because he'd learned that warmth wasn't something you achieved alone, but something you built with people who chose to stay. Luke had offered to lend him a mother 8 months ago, and somehow that simple act of kindness had led to this moment where he gained both a son and the love he'd stopped believing existed. "We should head home," Deborah said eventually, practical even in moments of emotional significance. "Luke has homework and I have lesson plans, and you probably have 17 business calls you're ignoring to sit here with us." "The calls can wait," Sean replied, standing and offering his hand to help Deborah up while Luke jumped down with 9-year-old energy. "Everything can wait. This is what matters. You're what matters." They walked to the parking area together, Luke between them holding both their hands, chattering about his day with the seamless transition children make from profound moments to everyday concerns. Sean listened with the attention he'd learned to give, present in ways he'd never been present for anything before meeting this remarkable boy and his extraordinary mother. His phone buzzed with ignored messages, empire demanding attention, but for the first time in 15 years, his empire was not the most important thing in his life. The parking lot's overhead lights flickered on as dusk deepened into evening, automated systems responding to fading natural light with the precision that characterized modern infrastructure. Other families moved through the space with the efficient choreography of people executing familiar routines, kids being buckled into car seats while parents juggled bags and briefcases, and the accumulated debris of daily life. Sean observed these ordinary scenes with new appreciation for their profound simplicity, understanding now what he'd been missing while building his empire in gray spaces between legal and illegal. These people might struggle with mortgage payments and credit card debt, might worry about promotions and college funds, but they had something his wealth couldn't purchase: the uncomplicated knowledge of where they belonged and who would notice if they didn't come home. Luke's chatter had moved from soccer to the spelling test he had Friday, expressing concerns about particular words he found challenging to remember. Deborah offered encouragement mixed with practical study strategies, her teacher training evident in how she broke complex tasks into manageable steps that built confidence alongside competence. Sean found himself making mental notes about her approach, storing information for future reference when he might need to help Luke with homework, assuming Deborah would allow that level of involvement in their lives. The presumption surprised him, this automatic planning for future that included responsibilities he'd never wanted before, but it felt natural rather than burdensome, evidence of how thoroughly these two people had rewritten his understanding of what made life worth living. A text from Marco appeared on his phone screen, visible even without unlocking the device, informing him that the legitimization project had hit unexpected complications with regulatory agencies. The message would have sent him into strategic planning mode a year ago, mind immediately analyzing angles and solutions, calculating risks and mapping contingencies. Now he simply acknowledged it with brief response, promising detailed discussion tomorrow, prioritizing the moment with Luke and Deborah over business crisis that wouldn't benefit from his immediate attention anyway. The shift in priorities felt foreign but correct, like finally speaking a language he'd been trying to learn through textbooks rather than immersion, understanding arriving through experience rather than intellectual effort. Deborah's car was older than Sean had initially realized. Small sedan with visible rust spots around the wheel wells, and a rear bumper held on with zip ties and determination. She caught him noticing, and her expression shifted defensively, before she seemed to decide not to apologize for circumstances she couldn't control. The contrast between his Mercedes and her struggling vehicle represented the economic canyon between their worlds more clearly than any conversation about his business ever could. But Luke climbed into the back seat completely unaware that his mother's car was anything less than perfect, his worldview not yet corrupted by the status measurements that obsessed adults. And Sean felt his respect for Deborah deepen at her obvious success in raising a child who valued people over possessions. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Luke asked as they reached Deborah's car, already assuming answer, but needing confirmation anyway. "You're coming to my soccer game, right? Coach says I'm getting really good at defense, because you taught me about watching the whole field instead of just the ball." "I wouldn't miss it," Sean promised, ruffling Luke's hair in gesture that had become routine between them. "Bring your art supplies after. I want to work on that landscape we started last week." He kissed Deborah goodbye with the tenderness of someone who'd learned that gentleness was strength rather than weakness, and watched them drive away into evening traffic. The park behind him was empty now, peaceful in approaching darkness, and Sean stood for a moment longer, breathing in the space that had changed everything. Tomorrow he had meetings about legitimizing operations, conversations with lawyers about making his business defensible in daylight, plans that would take years to fully implement but that he'd committed to completely. The man who'd sat crying on that bench had been saved by a child's simple kindness, and in being saved had learned to save himself through choosing connection over isolation. It wasn't the ending he'd have written months ago, wouldn't have believed possible, but it was real, and it was his, and it was built on foundation of love that transcended every careful calculation he'd ever made. Thank you all for following this journey from that cold park bench to this moment of chosen family. If this story touched something in your heart, share in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing stories about redemption, connection, and the transformative power of unconditional kindness. Sometimes we all need someone to offer us warmth when we're sitting alone in the cold, and sometimes we get the chance to be that warmth for someone else.